All right, well, we ready? This is part 5 of 6 parts of Pilgrim's Progress. Next week we will have our members meeting, so we'll take a week off, but then we'll finish it up. And most of you were here Sunday morning. You heard the announcement that we're having Ty come in and do our fall revival starting November 1st on Sunday. And that's going to go Sunday night, or Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, and then Wednesday night we're actually going to play the film Pilgrim's Progress as we've been talking about. And it just lines up perfectly with the revival. And in fact, Ty is going to be preaching on the theme of perseverance, which fits in with this. So he and I were talking and trying to decide if we wanted to wait a week to play the film or play it that Wednesday night. And we both thought that would be a good idea. So I think it's all coming together and really looking forward to that. So we're getting close to the Celestial City. Just after tonight, one more session, and we'll make our way to the Celestial City. So last week, we were in not so great of a place, and the Valley of the Shadow of Death is where we left off. But Christian was just coming out of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and he caught up with a friend. Do you remember the friend that he caught up with? Remember his name? A real catchy name, yeah. It was Faithful. This guy, Faithful. Now, you'll also remember that they had an encounter with Evangelist, and Evangelist tells them that one of them is going to die. And that's where we left off. But I do want to back up, because before this encounter with Evangelist, there is another guy named Talkative, who doesn't appear in this picture book that we're often referring to, but he is in the original. And as with all the characters, you can kind of tell what Talkative is all about. He was a talkative fella, and in fact, he was all talk. And as you read through the original Pilgrim's Progress, you know, there are a number of pages where Christian and Faithful and Talkative is mostly a conversation between Faithful and Talkative, and it gets a little bit exhausting because Talkative is rather talkative. And you see this contrast between Talkative and Faithful. You see, again, that Talkative really is all talk. There's a shallowness about him. On the surface, at first, it might seem like he really knows his stuff, but when he's compared to Faithful, he falls short. And so we'll just leave it at that. But what we see is that Faithful is not only a good friend to Christian, but he's very solid in his faith, hence his name. And he's going to need that because... well, spoiler alert, is that he's the one who faces martyrdom, right? And we know it's not Christian because we still got a session to go here. And I guess Christian does die as well, because that's what it means to make it to the Celestial City. But it's Faithful that is going to die, just as Evangelist predicted. And so as we make our way out of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, tonight, we're going to go from Vanity Fair to Doubting Castle. So Vanity Fair is the next stop, and that probably sounds familiar to you, doesn't it? The term Vanity Fair. And you may or may not know why it rings a bell. I mean, it could be from Pilgrim's Progress, but there's actually a magazine called Vanity Fair, and it's kind of sad because this magazine was named after this place in Pilgrim's Progress. And of course, this place, Vanity Fair, is not a good place, as we'll see. But just let me read you a description of this magazine, Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair is a monthly magazine of popular culture, fashion, and current affairs, published by Condé Nast in the United States. The first version of Vanity Fair was published from 1913 to 1936. The imprint was revived in 1983 and currently includes 5 international editions of the magazine. And so, I mean, this is essentially a celebration of the kinds of things that we see in Vanity Fair in the Pilgrim's Progress, which again is not a good thing. And that's really hard to convince kids of. So, of course, you know, we're reading through this again with our kids, and we come to Vanity Fair, and I had to stress to them, okay, this isn't a good thing. I remember probably, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, we went to Shelbina. We actually picked up something we were buying off of somebody online, a table and chairs. And there in Shelbina, they were having, I don't know, county fair or something. So the kids, they saw the Ferris wheel and the other items there, and we drove there so they could see it. But the thing is, we were actually planning a trip to Silver Dollar City just a couple weeks later. We're meeting my parents there, and so we're telling the kids, hey, we're going to Silver Dollar City. We're not going to spend a ton of money on this. But of course, they wanted to go to the fair. And you know, that's the thing about fairs. They're very attractive, aren't they? And so Vanity Fair, of course, it had all kinds of things that were to attract and entertain people. Let me go ahead and open up my book here, and I'll read a section about Vanity Fair. Then I saw in my dream that Christian and faithful descended into the town of Vanity. They could hear the sounds of a fair, which is held all year round. It is called Vanity Fair. So this isn't a seasonal fair. It's not a county fair. It's a fair all year round. So that's the town. You can see the fair there in the distance. And there they are in the midst of it. Most fairs are merry places, but not this one, not for our travelers. For here one of them was destined to die. And in other fairs of less importance, as in other fairs of less importance, the streets are named after different countries. There's the French row and the Italian row and the British row, where the commodities of these countries are sold and bought. Indeed, there are stalls where every foolish trifle in the world is up for sale. Knickknacks of gold and silver, baubles and bric-a-brac and precious stones. In addition, you could buy titles and honors and preferments to high office, and vain pleasures and empty delights of every kind. Moving busily among the crowds are cheats and rogues and mountebanks. There's a lot of words in here that I'm learning, so I'm with you guys, and I'm just kind of faking my way through some of them. The air is full of fearful oaths, and murder, they say, is as common as theft. This fair is no newly erected business, but a thing of long standing. More than 1,000 years ago, there were pilgrims walking to the celestial city, as these two honest persons are. And Beelzebub, the prince of the demons, and Apollyon, and the legion, with Apollyon and legion and their companions, perceiving that the pilgrim's way lay through this town Vanity, contrived to set up a fair here. For he that would pass this town must needs go out of the world. So Christian and faithful had to pass through this lusty fair, and hoping they would go unnoticed, they pulled their collars up around their faces. But the rabble were quick to spot them. First they jeered at them for their outlandish clothes. Then they jeered at them for their foreign accents. Finally they asked them angrily, "Why aren't you buying our merchandise? Buy, buy, buy." "We buy only the truth," they said, and they put their fingers in their ears and sought to turn away their eyes from beholding vanity. At that the townsmen were more enraged, and the noisiest of hubbubs ensued. News of the hubbub presently reached the burgomaster, and he took the pilgrims to be lunatics, and he bade his officers to arrest them as disturbers of the peace and take their weapons from them. They were placed in a cage with their feet in stocks as a public spectacle. They lay there for some time and were made objects of any man's sport. So there they are in the cage. Notice it says that they were jeering at them for their funny clothes and for their foreign accents. Of course, this is an allegory, so it's not to say that Christians must dress in a funny way, but it is to say that Christians must, and true Christians indeed do, look different from the rest of the world. And that Christians will be ridiculed for looking different, for sounding different, for acting differently from the rest of the world. And so we see that with Christian and faithful. David Wells, he gives a definition of worldliness as follows: everything in a culture that makes sin look normal and righteousness odd. Everything in a culture that makes sin look normal and righteousness odd. And so we see that is exactly the case in Vanity Fair, that all of these things are pawned off as things that will make a person happy and things that a person ought to have. And whenever Christian and faithful don't buy these things, and when they pass through looking and acting differently than everyone else, they stand out and they are indeed ridiculed for it. Now, something that is important is that, so when I read the list here in this picture book, it was listing all of these very, very shallow and mostly sinful things that were being sold. But if we look at the original, I want to read to you the list of things sold in Vanity Fair here in the original. Here it is. Whores, bawds, which I don't, B-A-W-D-S. I didn't look that one up. So, no insight from you all either, huh? Wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, lives, blood, bodies, souls, silver, gold, pearls, precious stones, and whatnot. So you see that among these things are actually some very good things, right? Like wives and husbands and children. And I think what we see here is that even good things can become idols, can distract us from the Lord. And in fact, Christian himself knew this, right? Because he went on this journey without his wife and his children because they would not hear it, right? When he's there in the city of destruction and he tells them about what he's read in this book and how he must flee from the wrath to come and asks them to join him, and they won't. Instead, they made fun of him. Now, of course, this is not to say that a Christian should leave their unbelieving family, because, again, this is an allegory. It's not that he left them literally, but insofar as his journey is concerned, he was in this journey of the Christian faith on his own, and he couldn't let his family hold him back from that, right? And so we see that there are all kinds of things that can become idols, that can become vanities, and we must be aware of that. Any thoughts, questions on that before we move on? Ah, very good. So that goes along with whores, huh? All right, a woman in charge of a brothel. Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll have you look up other words as we come along them. So, Christian and faithful, they don't cave in to these demands, and so they are locked in this cage, and then they have a trial, but it's not much of a trial. The judge's name is Lord Hategood. Lord Hategood. And then there's a jury. I'll read a list of their names to you here in a moment. I wonder, have any of you served on a jury before? Yeah. I had a really interesting jury experience. Years ago, I was called to be on a jury, and the guy decided to defend himself. And he had some very strange beliefs. I think I talked with you about this once before, John. I'm actually kind of foggy on what he called himself now. Yes, he was a sovereign citizen. And so he basically believed that that the government had no ownership over him and had no right to prosecute him on anything. And so he gave some kind of outlandish defense, and it was a very interesting ordeal. But of course, there's this process for selecting the jury where the prosecutor and the defendant both get to have a say, and for some reason, I fit the bill for both of them enough that I was chosen to be on the jury. But this was not a fair jury for Christian and faithful. So let me read to you some of the names on the jury. Mr. Blind Man, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Lovelust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. Implacable. And this is, after all, the town of Vanity, and so that's their judge, again, Lord Hategood, and this is their jury. And so, as you can imagine, things don't turn out well. Now, I don't think it's really made clear as to why, but the focus here is on faithful. Faithful is maybe Christian was next on the docket. We're going to see Christian gets away. But first they're focusing their attention on Faithful, bringing about all these accusations against him. And he continues to be faithful. He continues to stand firm in the faith and not to waver on his conviction. And so they find him guilty. So we're kind of going back and forth between the books here. Let me read a section from this one. I'll show you some pictures of the jury as well. First of all, there's Mr. Hategood. I really like the art in this book. And there's the jury. It looks like a real reputable jury, huh? You feel like you ever have juries like that, John? All right, so he has all of these accusers, these witnesses come against him, and they find him guilty according to their laws. And after endless indignities, they burnt him at the stake. Thus Faithful met his end. But I saw in my dream that behind the crowds there stood a chariot and horses waiting for Faithful, who, as soon as his enemies had done with him, was taken up into it and wafted. I think he corrected me whenever I was reading this to the kids, and so now I'm self-conscious about it. Through the clouds to the sound of trumpets. So in truth, he fared better than his friend Christian. He would arrive first at the celestial city, and having been faithful unto death, the king would give him a crown of life. Now, if you remember, maybe from your own Bible reading, if not that, from my sermon series on the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation, which this was probably a couple of years ago now, but that was a phrase that we see there, to be faithful, and that he who is faithful will receive the crown of life. He who is faithful unto death will receive the crown of life. And so we see this with Faithful. Where had Christian been all this time? Well, one of the men of the fair, whose name was Hopeful, was much moved by the calm deportment of the pilgrims. And while the people crowded round to see the execution, he succeeded, as sometimes happens in a dream, in spiriting Christian away to safety. And now Christian and Hopeful traveled on together. So we see Hopeful, he is from the town of Vanity, there in even among Vanity Fair. And he was impressed by their testimony. He was moved by their testimony. And then certainly of Christian's testimony of being faithful unto death. It was Tertullian that said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so we see an example of that here. And of course, throughout church history, you see how martyrdom helps to advance the kingdom of God. The church grows in places of persecution, and people come to faith because of these testimonies. And so that was the case with Hopeful. And so Christian loses his friend Faithful, and now he gains a new friend, Hopeful, who is a brand new convert. And they travel on together. You know, speaking of being burnt at the stake, I just recently saw something online about, I'm not sure what anniversary it is, but Wycliffe, John Wycliffe, he was burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. And of course, there have been many throughout history who have faced that specific kind of death, which is a very terrible way to die, isn't it? And but again, it is a great testimony for us, and we can think about, would we be faithful unto death, even if we're facing being burned at the stake, facing all these kinds of things that we see both Christian and ultimately Faithful come against. And we ought to pray that we would and strive to have a kind of faith that would endure even in the face of such a trial. So Christian and Hopeful continue on the road to the celestial city, and they come to another town, and this is the town of Fair Speech. And basically this town is characterized by kind of a health and wealth religion. That's the way I see it, at least. it says that their religion is in silver slippers, whatever that means. But we see with the characters there that they are very much focused on health and wealth, kind of what feels good, what tickles the ears, to use the language of the Apostle Paul. I'll just read you some of the names because I come across a number of characters in this town fair speech. And really, these character names really just say a lot in and of themselves. So one was Mr. Buy-ins, which that basically means someone who has a hidden agenda, right, is seeking something for themselves. Mr. Moneylove, Mr. Save All, which that's probably referring to someone who is a universalist. So back then, just as today, there were those who would say, oh, well, everybody's going to be saved in the end. You don't have to repent and believe in Jesus. It's all going to work out well for everybody. Again, it's kind of a feel-good, this is what you want to hear kind of thing. So we see that in regards to money, but also even in regards to matters like eternal salvation. Mr. Smooth Man, Mr. Facing Both Ways, right? Just saying whatever anybody wants to hear, being a hypocrite, being inconsistent, and not holding to the truth, but just simply holding to what works or what feels good. Mr. Hold the World, and there's a handful of others, but that kind of gives us a good idea of these characters in Town of Fair Speech. So Christian and hopeful, they realize, okay, these are not people who are of good company, and so they continue on their way. And as they go along, they see up kind of on a hill, there's a silver mine, and it looks very dangerous, and it is indeed dangerous. But there's a man named Demas who insists that it's not dangerous at all. Now this is the name that we find in Scripture, 2 Timothy 4:10. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. That's the Apostle Paul writing there. And so he's speaking of this companion that was with him for a time, but then in love with this present world, deserted the Apostle Paul and went over to Thessalonica. And so this represents someone who has abandoned the advocacy of the gospel for the things of this world. And Christian and hopeful, they realize the danger, and this man Demas, he's telling them to come and to come dig in the mine. It's not dangerous at all, but they kind of hold back. But then along comes the citizens of Fair Speech, and they go and they look over into it greedily, it says, and they fall into this mine and are never heard from again. And so we see this theme of to beware of empty promises. So we see it in Vanity Fair, right? All of these worldly things that make these promises to satisfy and to entertain and so on. That these don't deliver what they say they will. They are for your destruction in the end. That's how it is with Vanity Fair, and with Vanity Fair we see it's very worldly, right? With Fair Speech, the town of Fair Speech, it has a religious nature to it, doesn't it? Again, like the health and wealth, and so we can kind of think of that just in our world today, right? Some Christians. We just can think of people in general, might be tempted by the things that are explicitly secular and sinful, and saying, hey, come for a good time, this will satisfy your desires. But then others might want it dressed up in the trappings of religion and say, okay, well, if I go this route, then I can have God, in quotation marks, and everything else that I want. In fact, God is the means for me to get the things that I want. Often material possessions, but all kinds of things are often promised in the name of God. And so I think what we see with Demas is that really this is all one and the same. They're just dressed up differently. Because again, it is these people from Fair Speech, from these people who are religious in some way, that end up falling into this pit and this silver mine because of their greed, and they're deceived by one who, again, according to 2 Timothy 4:10, was in love with this present world. And so I think as we consider those things, and as we consider, again, Vanity Fair, we just see it's dressed up in different ways, but it's all empty promises. And so as Christian hopeful journey along, they find a pillar, and the pillar is in the shape of a woman. Anybody know where this is going? Pillar of salt? Yes. And it says, remember Lot's wife. That is, don't look back, right? Don't look back. Don't be enticed by these things. Again, I'll give you the opportunity. Anybody want to jump in and make any comments before we move along? This is all pretty relevant to us, isn't it? I think we can see how even almost 400 years later, we face the same kinds of trials and temptations and so on. So they resist all of these promises for fulfillment, and then finally they do come for a time to a place of peace. And I'm going to read a section here from the original. I think the lesson here is that, the Christian life is indeed full of trials and dangers, and we are called to persevere, to fight in many times, and to not give in to those things that would make life easy. I think it's kind of similar to, remember when we talked about resting the wrong way and the right way, like when Christian, he fell asleep on the path, and he also comes across like simple and sloth and presumption who are sleeping, and that's not the way we are to rest. We're not to let down our guard, and yet he finds rest in the palace beautiful. He finds rest among the saints in the church. And so there's a right way to find rest, where we are resting and we're supported by others and encouraged by others in the church, versus the kind of rest where we're being slothful and letting down our guard and being presumptuous. And so I think similar to that, we see that because we all desire peace, we all desire things to not always be so hard, right? And there's a wrong way to find relief from that, in the things of this world, Vanity Fair or fair speech. But if we wait on the Lord, we find that He will give us the refreshment and what we need as we go through this journey in the Christian life. And so let me read you this section. After they have now passed through Vanity Fair and fair speech, and past the silver mine, they see this warning of Lot's wife. Now they come to a very peaceful place. It says, I saw then that they went on their way to a pleasant river, which David the king called the river of God. But John called it the river of the water of life. Now their way lay just upon the bank of the river. Here, therefore, Christian and his companion walked with great delight. They drank also of the water of the river, which was pleasant and enlivening to their weary spirits. Besides, on the banks of the river, on either side, were green trees that bear all manner of fruit, and the leaves of the trees were good for medicine. With the fruit of these trees they were also much delighted, and the leaves they ate to prevent, there's another word, surfeits, and other diseases that are incident to those that heat their blood by travels. And then on the other side of the river was also a meadow, curiously beautiful with lilies, and it was green all year long. In this meadow they lay down and slept, for here they might lay down safely. When they awoke, they gathered again of the fruit of the trees, and they drank again of the water of the river, and they lay down again to sleep. Thus they did for several days and nights. Of course, this represents the peace that we all are promised in the next life, that we all look forward to. But God is gracious to give us taste of that even in the here and now, and He's gracious to give us the rest and the refreshment that we need. But we must not fall for counterfeits that will, in the end, lead to destruction. We resist the temptation to be slothful. We resist the temptation to give into the pleasures of this world and find our delight in those things. And we continue down the straight and narrow, and we trust God to give us what we need. So we see that, and again for a number of days they're able to enjoy this, but then they get back on the path and they continue towards the celestial city. And as they're walking down the path, there is a place off to the side called Bypath Meadow. It's a very nice meadow, and there's a path through the meadow, but it's not the path that they're on, and there's even a little fence that fences off this meadow. And Christian decides that it might be a good idea to go off onto this path into the meadow. You would think that he would know better. It's maybe a little bit different from what he's... Remember, there were others earlier in the story where they had jumped the fence and had bypassed even going through the wicket gate. And so that was quite a serious thing. This maybe is not quite the same, but nevertheless, he is veering off the path and hopeful. Well, he's a new convert, and so he goes along. Right? He's not quite as sure about it, but he goes along. And maybe this says something to us about our responsibility as we're guiding along new believers, that we ought to be careful to not lead them down the wrong path. But one thing that gives Christian comfort is that he sees a person walking down the path. He didn't know what the guy's name was. The guy's name was Vain Confidence. And so they see this guy, and so they kind of follow after him. And as they're following after him for some time, he kind of gets out of their view, and then they hear a shriek, and then nothing. And so I think at that point they realize, okay, this isn't good, and we need to find our way back. But then a big storm comes, and it's raining hard. In fact, floodwaters rise. They almost drown. They have to find a place to preserve themselves, and they find kind of a high cliff that has almost like a little cave that they find shelter in. And they're exhausted, and so they fall asleep there in the shelter. But in the morning, they're awakened by someone, and it's not good. So once again, I'll open up here, and well, you see here who they're awakened by. It is Giant Despair. It was broad daylight when they were awakened by a grim and surly voice. "What are you doing?" it said. "In my private grounds." Looking up, they saw before them the gloomy figure of Giant Despair, owner of Doubting Castle, out for his morning walk. "We're just poor pilgrims who've lost our way," they said. "You're trespassing," said Giant. "Trampling down my fields. I'll have to teach you a lesson." They had little to say. They knew they were in the wrong, and since he was stronger than they were forced to accompany him. In the light of day, they could now see before them the battlements of Doubting Castle. Here they were cast into a dungeon, dark and stinking, and here they lay from Wednesday morning till Saturday night, without one bite of bread or one drop of water. No one came to visit them. They were cut off from their friends. No one knew where they were. Christian realized it was all his fault for taking the shortcut, and this caused him double sorrow. So again, there's Giant Despair, and here's this dungeon in Doubting Castle. So, no water, no food, no light. This was something that Bunyan could relate to. He could relate to it on a spiritual level. He wrote elsewhere in his autobiography about his spiritual depression that he went through. Also, remember that he wrote this while he himself was in prison, and so I'm sure could relate in some ways there as well. This section of Pilgrim's Progress is a really dark section, similar to the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And on one hand, we might think, okay, these dark sections are kind of discouraging, but ultimately I think they're encouraging because it helps believers know that, if they're experiencing such turmoil, depression, and so on, that they're not alone, that this is an experience of the Christian life, and that it's something that believers can get through. And so Bunyan himself, again, experienced this. Now notice in that it said that they were in the castle from Wednesday morning to Saturday night. It's interesting that it specifies that time period, those days. And so it's speculated, and this seems pretty certain to me, that this must be a parallel with Jesus, right? And so we think of Wednesday as when Jesus was betrayed by Judas. That is whenever Judas made the deal with the chief priest. And remember, Jesus knew what was going on. And so we have this betrayal of a friend that starts on Wednesday. Thursday is when he is praying in the garden and is arrested. Friday is when he is executed. And as he hangs there on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It turns dark, right? And then he lay in the tomb Friday evening and Saturday, but Sunday's coming. Have you guys heard that old sermon, Sunday's coming? The preacher says over and over and over, but Sunday's coming. So that's true. But man, Christian and hopeful, they didn't feel like it. They didn't know this. So we have this perspective from the outside, knowing that Sunday's coming. But for them, they were in despair, right? Giant despair, doubting castle. As we think about doubt, oftentimes we might just simply think of someone who is maybe they're doubting the existence of God, or doubting, the facts of the Bible, that Jesus is who he said he was. Of course, those are kinds of doubts that people have. But there's also the kinds of doubts like, does God really love me? Does he hear my prayers? Is he looking out for me? Are things really working out for my good? How can God make something good of such and such? Is there any hope at all? And so there's this hopelessness, there's this doubt in the goodness of God, maybe even in the promises of God. And so this despair and this doubt, of course, go hand in hand, and it's something that they struggle with. Christian, in particular, is struggling with this kind of doubt and despair and depression. And so not only do we have a giant despair, but we also have his wife, diffidence, which means suspicion or distrust. I'm not going to read any more from this, but I got to show you her picture. And I made sure to tell the kids that their mama was much more beautiful than this. And so this is kind of like a real grumpy, nagging kind of wife, I guess. And she's always telling Giant Despair what to do, and she tells them that he needs to go and beat these prisoners. And so he does. He goes and he gets a club and he beats them real good. And he even tells them that they ought to end their life. Which this is a very, very dark place, isn't it? I'm watching some lectures on this, and that's where I'm getting a lot of my insights. And he noted, that this book was written for parents to read to their children. It's a family book, and yet Bunyan felt it important to put this in there. And as dark as this is, Giant Despair telling them to take their own life. Well, we've seen, you see these terribly sad stories on the news of even young children taking their own life. It seems like it's even increasingly the case. You see it in people of all ages, all walks of life. You see it among pastors, right? Lots of stories of pastors taking their own lives. It's something that I don't know if Bunyan himself struggled ever struggled with thoughts of suicide. He certainly struggled with thoughts of depression. We see in the Pilgrim's Progress that this was a real temptation, at least for Christian, if not for them both. This was a real temptation. And so it just reading this story and seeing how it plays out, I think can be very comforting for Christians who struggle with these kinds of dark doubts and despair and even the temptation to end their life. We see that hopeful comes through for Christian and gives him much encouragement and gives him many reasons why he should not take his own life. And kind of on the tail end of this, Christian remembers that he has a key. He has a key in his bosom. And he says it's a key called promise. Maybe this key will open up the door and the gates and let us out. And so he takes this key, and indeed it does work. And so, of course, this represents the promises of God. The promise that God does hear our prayers, that God does care for us, that God is good, that God is working everything for our good. The promises of the gospel, right? That one day all things will be made right, that we must persevere to the end and be faithful even unto death. But not by taking our own life, but by pressing on. And so they're able to escape Doubting Castle with giant despair chasing after them. But they get away, they get back to the road, and they decide they ought to put up a sign there to warn others. And so they do that. And that's I think that has a lot of meaning for us as well. Right? We want to warn others. We want to help others as they face these kinds of difficulties in life. And so now they have made it back to the path to the celestial city. And so next time we will see what all the rest of their journey entails. So I'll close this with a word of prayer and we'll be done. God, we thank you for these many lessons that we've learned tonight about not being deceived by the empty promises of this world. We see the value of good friendship with other believers. We see the friendship of Christian and faithful and Christian and hopeful, and especially how hopeful helps Christian out of his despair. Lord, help us to help others, and for us to ourselves be encouraged by the promises of God and the fact that you are with us and that we can continue on, that we can persevere in the faith. And I pray, Lord, that you empower us to do so. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.